The ace of spades hit the scarred wooden table with a finality that silenced the raucous noise of the Dusty Creek saloon. It was a suffocating summer evening in 1883, the kind where the heat hung heavy in the air, smelling of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and tobacco smoke. In the corner of the room, standing as still as a statue, was May Lynn. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the dirty sawdust covering the floorboards, trying to make herself invisible. She was used to being unwanted. Her father, a desperate man with gambling debts that piled higher than the Sierra Nevada, had called her the ugly one since she was a child, not because she lacked beauty, but because she lacked the dowry and the submissive charm he believed a daughter should possess. Tonight, the desperation in his eyes was frantic. He had lost his gold, his horse, and the last of his dignity. Across the table sat a man named Declan, a grimy drifter with a smile that looked like a jagged scar. Declan reached for the pile of chips, his laugh grating against the tension in the room, but May Lynn's father slammed a trembling hand down on the wood. "Wait," he croaked, sweat dripping from his brow. "I have one more thing. My daughter." The saloon went quiet. Even the piano player stopped mid-measure. May Lynn felt the blood drain from her face, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She dared to look up, her dark eyes wide with terror. Her father wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the cards, praying for a miracle that would never come. "She works hard," her father stammered, his voice rising in pitch. "She cooks, she cleans, she's sturdy." The word hung in the air like an insult. Declan looked her up and down, sneering with open disgust. "That one? She looks like she'd break if I sneezed. But fine, deal the cards." The room held its breath as the final hand was dealt. It was a cruel twist of fate, a moment where a human life was reduced to the turn of a card. Her father's hand shook as he revealed a pair of kings. He looked triumphant for a split second, until Declan slowly flipped over 3 aces. The groan from her father was a sound of pure ruin. He slumped back in his chair, defeated. Declan stood up, spitting on the floor. "I don't want her," he growled, grabbing the cash and the deed to the horse. "She's useless to me. Leave her for the wolves." It was then that a shadow detached itself from the back of the room. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a dust-coated coat stepped forward. He had been watching the game in silence, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him. This was Grant. He tossed a heavy bag of coins onto the table, more than the pot was worth. "I'll take the debt," Grant said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "And the girl comes with me." Before we find out what fate awaits May Lynn at the hands of this mysterious rancher, take a quick moment to let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our community grow from all corners of the world. And if you enjoy stories of justice and unexpected romance, please hit that like button. It really helps us share these stories with more people. Now, let's get back to the Dusty Creek Saloon. Grant did not wait for an answer. He did not look at May Lynn's father, who was too busy clutching the bag of coins to care that he had just sold his own flesh and blood. Grant simply walked over to where May Lynn stood, her body trembling so violently she could barely stand. He didn't grab her arm or drag her. He simply nodded toward the swinging doors. "Let's go," he said. It wasn't a command born of cruelty, but a statement of fact. May Lynn hesitated, looking one last time at the man who had raised her, the man who was now counting silver pieces with a greedy grin. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had no family. She was truly alone in a land that viewed her as a curiosity at best and a burden at worst. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she turned her back on her father and followed the tall stranger out into the blinding glare of the late afternoon sun. The town of Dusty Creek was watching. Curious eyes peeked from behind curtains and store windows. They whispered as they passed, the solitary rancher and the unwanted daughter. Mei Lin kept her head bowed, shame burning her cheeks. She expected Grant to tell her to walk behind the wagon, or perhaps to tie her hands, but he did neither. He stopped beside a sturdy buckboard wagon pulled by two roan horses. He climbed up, then looked down at her, extending a calloused hand. "It's a long ride," Grant said, his eyes obscured by the brim of his hat. "You best get up here." Mei Lin stared at the hand. It was large, rough, and stained with the work of the land, yet it was held open in an offer of assistance, not violence. Tentatively, she placed her small hand in his. His grip was firm but gentle as he hoisted her up onto the wooden bench seat beside him. He didn't smile, and he didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply flicked the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, leaving the noise and the shame of the saloon behind. As the town faded into the distance, replaced by the endless expanse of sagebrush and red earth, Mei Lin sat rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had no idea where she was going or what this man expected of her. Was she to be a servant? A slave? Or something worse? She stole a glance at his profile. He was a handsome man in a rugged, weathered way, with a jawline set like granite and lines of deep thought etched around his eyes. He stared straight ahead, focused on the horizon. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken questions and the terrifying unknown. For the first time in her life, Mei Lin was heading toward a destiny she hadn't chosen, with a man whose name she barely knew, under the scorching heat of a western summer that promised no mercy. The journey to Grant's ranch was a test of endurance. The summer sun beat down on the open wagon with relentless intensity, turning the air into a shimmering haze of heat. The landscape was vast and unforgiving, a sea of dry grass and rocky outcrops that stretched as far as the eye could see. For hours, the only sounds were the rhythmic creaking of the wagon wheels, the snort of the horses, and the incessant buzzing of cicadas hidden in the scrub. Mei Lin sat perfectly still despite the sweat trickling down her back and the dust coating her throat. She was afraid to move, afraid to draw attention to herself. In her father's house, invisibility had been her only defense. She watched the horizon, mesmerizing in its emptiness. She had never been this far out of town. The wildness of the territory was both beautiful and terrifying. It was a place where civilization held no sway, where survival was earned, not given. Grant remained silent for the first few hours, his focus entirely on guiding the horses through the uneven terrain. He wasn't a man of many words. Solitude had been his companion for so long that conversation felt foreign to his tongue. However, he was acutely aware of the woman beside him. He could feel her tension, the way she held her breath whenever the wagon hit a rut. He wasn't blind to her fear. He knew what men like Declan and her father were like. He knew she expected him to be the same. The thought soured his mood, not at her, but at the world that had taught her to fear a helping hand. Around midday, Grant pulled the horses to a stop beneath the shade of a lone, gnarled oak tree near a trickling creek. "We rest here," he announced, his voice startling her. He jumped down and moved to the back of the wagon, retrieving a canteen and a wrapped bundle of dried meat and biscuits. He uncorked the canteen and took a swig, then wiped the mouth of the bottle with his sleeve before offering it to her. Mei Lin stared at the canteen, then at him. "Drink," he said softly. "You'll dehydrate out here before you know it." She took the canteen with shaking hands. The water was lukewarm but tasted like the sweetest nectar she had ever known. She drank greedily, some of it spilling down her chin. She quickly wiped it away, fearful of a reprimand, but Grant was already busy checking the horses' hooves. He wasn't watching her like a hawk. He was giving her space. They ate in silence, sitting on the dry grass. Mei Lin nibbled on a biscuit, her hunger finally overriding her anxiety. "My name is Grant," he said suddenly, looking out at the rolling hills. He didn't look at her as if trying to make it easier for her to listen. "I run a spread north of here. Cattle mostly. It's quiet work. Lonely work." He paused, chewing slowly. "I didn't buy you to be a slave, miss. And I didn't buy you to, well, I ain't looking for what those men in the saloon were thinking." Maylin looked up, surprised by his candor. His voice was gruff, but there was an undercurrent of honor in it. "Then why?" she whispered. It was the first word she had spoken since leaving the saloon. Her voice was melodic, soft like the wind through the canyon. Grant turned to look at her then, his blue eyes piercing but kind. "Because no one deserves to be wagered on a pair of cards," he replied simply. "And because my house is big and the silence gets loud. I reckoned we could both use a change of fortune." He stood up, dusting off his trousers. "Let's move. We'll be home by sundown." As she climbed back into the wagon, Maylin felt a tiny, fragile spark ignite in her chest. It wasn't quite hope. She knew better than to trust hope yet, but it was the absence of immediate terror. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of violet, orange, and bruised purple when the ranch finally came into view. It sat in a valley protected by a ridge of limestone cliffs, a sprawling patch of tamed land in the middle of the wilderness. The main house was a 2-story structure made of timber and stone, sturdy and imposing. It wasn't a rich man's mansion, but it was built to last, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and smoke curling lazily from the chimney. A barn stood nearby, along with several corrals where cattle lowed softly in the twilight. To Maylin, who had lived in a cramped, rented shack behind the saloon, it looked like a palace. Grant guided the wagon through the main gate, the dogs barking in greeting, not aggressively, but with excitement at their master's return. He pulled the wagon up to the front of the house and set the brake. "We're here," he said, exhaling a breath he seemed to have been holding for miles. He helped her down, and for the first time, Maylin took a good look at her surroundings. The air here was cleaner, cooler than in town. There was a scent of pine and sage that filled her lungs. Grant led her up the porch steps, the wood creaking familiarly under his boots. He pushed the heavy oak door open and gestured for her to enter. The interior was shadowed, illuminated only by the dying light from the windows, but she could see it was a bachelor's home. It was clean but cluttered with the tools of his trade. A saddle in the corner, stacks of ledgers on a table, a coat rack overflowing with oilskins. There were no feminine touches, no curtains, no rugs, no flowers. It was a house of utility. Grant lit a kerosene lamp, the golden glow chasing away the shadows. "Kitchen's through there," he pointed. "Dining table here. My room is down the hall." He paused, then pointed to a staircase. "There's a room upstairs. It's been empty. It's yours." Maylin looked at him, confusion clouding her features. "Mine?" she asked. Grant nodded. "It has a bed, a dresser, and a lock on the door." He looked her dead in the eye when he said that. "You're the only one with a key. You lock it at night if it makes you sleep better. I won't disturb you." The weight of his words settled on her. A lock. A choice. Safety. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden. She had expected a corner on the floor or a spot in the barn. To be given a room and the power to lock the world out was a gift she hadn't known she needed. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching her skirt. Grant looked uncomfortable with her gratitude, rubbing the back of his neck. "There's water in the basin upstairs. Freshen up. I'll see about supper." He turned and walked into the kitchen, leaving her standing in the foyer of a home that felt strange, frightening, and yet, miraculously, safe. She ascended the stairs slowly, her hand trailing along the smooth wood of the banister, wondering if this was a dream she would wake up from. The first few days at the ranch were a delicate dance of avoidance and observation. Maylin moved through the house like a ghost, terrified of making a mistake that would send her back to the hell she had escaped. She woke before dawn, driven by a lifetime of conditioning that told her worth was measured in labor. While Grant was out checking the herds in the early morning light, she went to work. She swept the dust from the floorboards until they shone. She organized the chaotic pile of ledgers. She found a sack of flour and some dried apples in the pantry and set about making something edible. She wasn't used to such a well-stocked kitchen, even if it was disorganized. Her hands, small and deft, kneaded dough with a rhythm that soothed her racing mind. Cooking was the one thing her father hadn't criticized, mostly because it kept him fed. Here, in this silent house, it became her way of speaking, her way of saying, "I am useful." When Grant returned at midday, the house smelled different. It didn't smell like stale air and old leather anymore. It smelled of warm bread and cinnamon. He stopped in the doorway, his boots covered in red dust, and stared. The table was set. Not just thrown together, but set properly. There was a loaf of fresh bread, a pot of stew made from the salted beef he had left out, and a pitcher of water. Maylin stood by the stove, wiping her hands on an apron she had found. She looked at him with wide, anxious eyes, waiting for the criticism. I made lunch," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I hope it is acceptable." Grant walked to the table and sat down heavily. He looked at the food, then at her. He tore off a piece of the bread and took a bite. He chewed slowly, his expression unreadable. Maylin held her breath. Finally, he looked up, and the harsh lines of his face softened. "I haven't had fresh bread in 3 years," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I usually eat hardtack and jerky." "Is it good?" she asked. Grant nodded, taking another large bite. "It's the best thing I've eaten in a long time, Maylin." He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit. You eat too." She hesitated. "I can eat in the kitchen." "Sit," he repeated, firmly but kindly. "At this table, we eat together." She sat, perching on the edge of the chair. As they ate, the silence between them began to change. It was no longer the tense silence of strangers, but the companionable quiet of two people sharing a basic human comfort. Outside, the wind began to pick up, howling around the eaves of the house. Grant glanced at the window. "Storm's coming," he noted, his brow furrowing. "A dust storm, a big one." He stood up quickly. "I need to secure the barn doors and get the horses in. Stay inside." He grabbed his hat and rushed out. Maylin watched him go. She could see the wall of brown dust approaching from the horizon, swallowing the sky. Fear spiked in her chest, not of the man, but of the untamed world outside. But then she looked at the table, at the empty plate where he had eaten her bread, and she made a decision. She wasn't going to hide in her room. If this was her home now, she would help protect it. She grabbed a heavy shawl, wrapped it around her head, and stepped out onto the porch to help him, the wind tearing at her dress as the first grains of sand stung her face. The wind hit Maylin with the force of a physical blow, a wall of grit and fury that nearly knocked her off her feet. The sky had turned a bruising shade of purple, swallowed by the roiling cloud of red dust that raced across the plains. She squinted against the stinging sand, her shawl whipped violently around her face, and pushed forward toward the barn. Through the haze, she saw Grant struggling with the heavy double doors. The wind had caught one side, pinning it back, and the horses inside were screaming in panic. He was strong, but the gale was stronger, threatening to tear the wood from its hinges. Maylin didn't think, she simply acted. She threw her weight against the door, her small boots digging into the shifting earth. Grant looked down, shock registering in his eyes for a split second before he gritted his teeth and used the momentary leverage she provided to heave the latch into place. "Get back to the house!" he roared over the howling wind, grabbing her arm to steady her. But the storm was upon them now, a suffocating blanket of darkness. They couldn't see the house, only the swirling chaos. Grant pulled her close, shielding her body with his own, his heavy coat creating a small pocket of air as they stumbled blindly toward the porch. They moved as one entity, fighting the elements until their boots hit the wooden steps. Grant kicked the door open, shoved her inside, and slammed it shut, throwing the deadbolt with a finality that echoed in the sudden silence. Inside, the air was still, though the house groaned and shuddered under the assault of the wind. Maylin stood in the foyer, gasping for breath, her hair wild and coated in fine red dust. She looked at Grant. He was leaning against the door, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on her. The adrenaline of the moment stripped away the awkwardness that had existed between them. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before gently brushing a smudge of dirt from her cheek. His touch was electric, a stark contrast to the violence of the storm outside. "You shouldn't have come out," he said, his voice low and rough. "You could have been blown away." Maylin looked up at him, her heart pounding not from fear, but from the intensity of his gaze. "You needed help," she replied simply, her voice steady. "I am not fragile, Grant. I told you I can work." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, softening the rugged planes of his face. "I reckon you did," he admitted, "and I reckon I'm glad you were there." He pushed himself off the door. "The storm will rage for hours. We might as well wait it out by the fire." That evening the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the crackle of the logs in the hearth, and the howling wind that made the safety of the room feel even more precious. Grant poured 2 cups of coffee, the dark liquid steaming in the cool air. They sat in the 2 armchairs facing the fire, the distance between them feeling shorter than it ever had. For the first time, Grant spoke of his past, not the surface details, but the hollow aches. He told her of the family he lost to a fever years ago, the reason the house was so big and so empty. He spoke of the loneliness that settles in a man's bones when he has only cattle for company. Maylin listened, her eyes soft with empathy. In turn, she spoke of her mother, who had taught her to find beauty in small things before she passed, and of the dreams she had buried under the weight of her father's gambling debts. It was a bearing of souls, a weaving of 2 broken threads into something new. As the fire died down to embers, Grant looked at her, really looked at her, not as a purchase or a guest, but as a woman who had walked into the storm for him. The air between them was thick with unsaid words, a delicate tension that felt like the promise of rain after a drought. The next morning the world was silent. The sun rose over a landscape transformed, covered in a blanket of red dust that shimmered like gold in the morning light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt holy. Maylin woke early, as was her habit, but she found Grant already in the kitchen. He wasn't working. He was waiting. On the table sat a small wooden box. He looked up as she entered, a hint of nervousness in his posture. "Mornin'," he mumbled, pushing the box toward her. I found these in the supply shed. I forgot I had them." Maylin approached the table slowly, her fingers brushing the smooth wood of the box. She opened it to find packets of seeds, wildflowers, vegetables, and herbs. She looked up at him, confusion and delight warring in her eyes. "For the garden," Grant explained, rubbing the back of his neck. "There's a patch of good soil round the back, near the kitchen window. I thought you might like to make something grow here, since you're staying." The gesture was so simple, yet it carried the weight of a vow. He wasn't just giving her seeds. He was giving her a future. He was telling her that she belonged here, rooted in this earth. Tears pricked Maylin's eyes, but she blinked them away, a radiant smile breaking across her face. "I would like that very much," she whispered. The morning was spent in a comfortable domestic rhythm. They worked side by side to sweep the dust from the porch, their movements synchronized. Every now and then their arms would brush, or their eyes would meet, and a flush would rise to Maylin's cheeks. Grant, usually so stoic, found himself lingering near her, finding excuses to be in the same room. He watched the way the sunlight caught the blue-black sheen of her hair, the way her hands moved with grace even when doing the most mundane chores. He was falling, slowly and terrified, for the woman who had been forced into his life. But the peace of the frontier is a fragile thing. Just past noon, the dogs began to bark, a low, guttural warning that made the hair on Grant's arms stand up. He walked to the edge of the porch, shading his eyes against the glare. On the horizon, a cloud of dust was approaching, but this was not a storm. It was riders. 4 of them. As they drew closer, the silhouette of the lead rider became chillingly familiar. It was Declan, the man who had lost the hand of cards, and he wasn't alone. He was flanked by 3 rough-looking hired guns, men who wore violence like a second skin. Panic flared in Maylin's chest, cold and sharp. She stepped onto the porch, her hand gripping the railing until her knuckles turned white. Grant turned to her, his face hardening into a mask of deadly resolve. "Go inside, Maylin," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Lock the door." But Maylin shook her head. She saw the way Declan sat on his horse, arrogant and sneering, and something inside her snapped. She was done hiding. She was done being the victim in the shadows. "No," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I will not hide in my own home." Grant looked at her, surprised by her steel, and gave a sharp nod. He stepped in front of her, his hand resting casually, dangerously, on the handle of the revolver at his hip. The riders pulled up to the gate, the horses stamping nervously. Declan swung down from his saddle, his spurs jingling in the silence. He looked worse than he had in the saloon, his eyes bloodshot, his clothes stained. He looked like a man who had lost everything and was looking for someone to blame. "Well, look at this," Declan spat, gesturing to the house. "Domestic bliss, ain't it sweet?" He took a step forward but stopped when Grant unlatched the safety on his holster. The click was quiet, but it roared across the yard. "You're trespassing, Declan," Grant said, his voice ice cold. "State your business or turn around." Declan laughed, a jagged, ugly sound. "My business? My business is that I was cheated. That girl," he pointed a dirty finger at Maylin, "was part of a pot that was rigged. I want her back. Or I want the money she's worth. $500. The hired guns behind him shifted, hands hovering over their weapons. It was a shakedown, plain and simple. Maylin stepped out from behind Grant. She felt the fear, yes, but beneath it burned a fire she hadn't known she possessed. "I am not a thing to be returned," she called out, her voice ringing clear across the yard. "And I am not yours." Declan sneered, his face twisting with malice. "You shut your mouth, girl. You're whatever the men say you are." He lunged forward, intending to intimidate, to grab, to take. But he never made it past the gate. Grant moved with a speed that belied his size. He drew his revolver in a blur of motion, firing a single shot that kicked up the dirt less than an inch from Declan's boot. The horsemen behind him flinched, their hands freezing. "The next one goes in your knee," Grant warned, his voice devoid of anger, replaced by a terrifying calm. "She told you she ain't yours, and she ain't property. She's the lady of this house." The declaration hung in the air. The lady of this house. It wasn't just a defense, it was a claim. Declan looked at Grant, then at the gun, and finally at the 3 men behind him, who were slowly backing their horses away, unwilling to die for a drifter's grudge. The balance of power had shifted. Grant wasn't just a rancher defending land. He was a man defending his heart, and that made him dangerous in a way Declan couldn't match. Scowling, Declan spat on the ground one last time. "This ain't over," he muttered, though his eyes betrayed his fear. "It is," Grant replied. "Ride out, and if I see you within 10 miles of this ranch again, I won't aim for the dirt." Declan scrambled back onto his horse, humiliation burning his face, and turned the animal sharply. The group galloped away, disappearing into the heat haze from which they came. As the dust from the riders settled, the tension in Grant's shoulders finally broke. He didn't holster his gun immediately. He watched until they were mere specks on the horizon. Only then did he turn to Mei Lin. She was standing frozen, staring at the spot where the men had been, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The reality of the violence, of how close she had come to being dragged back into the darkness, washed over her. Grant closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't ask if she was okay. He could see the tremors running through her hands. Instead, he did something he had wanted to do since the night of the storm. He reached out and pulled her into his arms. It wasn't a tentative embrace this time. It was fierce, protective, and desperate. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of soap and sage, grounding himself in the reality that she was still there. "I would have killed him," Grant whispered against her hair, the confession shuddering through his body. "I wouldn't have hesitated." Mei Lin pressed her face against the rough cotton of his shirt, listening to the frantic beat of his heart. It matched her own. She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding on just as tightly. "I know," she murmured. She pulled back slightly, just enough to look up into his eyes. They were blue and stormy, filled with a mixture of relief and a raw, unguarded affection that took her breath away. "You called me the lady of the house," she said softly. Grant's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. The calluses on his palms felt like safety. They felt like home. "You are," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You have been since you walked through that door. I was too scared to say it. I didn't want to spook you." Mei Lin leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. "I am not spooked, Grant. I am exactly where I want to be." The admission hung between them, sweet and heavy. Grant lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. She rose on her toes to meet him. When his lips brushed hers, it was soft. A gentle exploration that spoke of reverence rather than possession. It was a kiss of promises kept and futures imagined. The harsh sun beat down on the ranch, but on the porch, in the circle of his arms, everything was cool and quiet. It was the moment the bargain ended and the love story began. There were no more debts to be paid, no more cards to be dealt. There was only Grant and Mei Lin and the life they were choosing, freely and together. 1 year later, the summer sun was setting over the valley, casting long golden shadows across the grass. The ranch had changed. The porch was lined with pots of blooming geraniums and wild sage, their bright colors a stark contrast to the weathered wood. In the garden patch behind the house, vegetables grew in neat, thriving rows. The house itself felt alive, filled with the scents of spices and the sounds of laughter. Mei Lin stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, watching the figure riding in from the pasture. She wore a dress of blue calico, the fabric crisp and clean, and her hair was pinned up with a silver comb, a gift from Grant for their first Christmas. She wasn't the terrified girl in the saloon anymore. She was confident, loved, and undeniably at home. Grant rode up to the gate, dismounting with an ease that came from a lighter heart. He tied his horse and walked up the steps, his eyes finding hers immediately. He looked tired from the day's work, but the shadows that used to haunt his face were gone, replaced by a deep contentment. "Supper smells good," he said, wrapping an arm around her waist and kissing her temple. "Beef stew and dumplings," she replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. They stood there for a moment, looking out over their land. The cattle were grazing peacefully, the barn was secure, and the sky was painting a masterpiece just for them. It was a simple life, a hard life, but it was theirs. "You know," Grant mused, looking at the distant purple hills, "I used to think that poker game was the strangest luck I ever had." Mei Lin looked up at him, smiling. "And now?" Grant pulled her closer, his hand resting over hers. Now I reckon it was the only hand I ever really won. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars began to twinkle in the twilight. They turned and walked into the house together, closing the door on the night, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring, side by side. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey of redemption and romance. It's stories like Maylin and Grant's that remind us that even in the harshest of places, love can bloom. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the frontier. Until next time, keep your heart open to the unexpected.